Good morning, everyone. We'll probably have people trickling in. I think Mass went a little long with the baptismal scrutinies, and Lazarus always takes a long time to be raised for whatever reason every year. We will meet next week if you would like. I'm planning to be here. Initially, this was going to run until the 5th Sunday of Lent, but we missed that second Sunday, if you all remember. So I'm planning to present next week, and we'll wrap up. And here, finally, we get into really the meat, the heart of these teachings, at least for me. I was chatting with some of these friends earlier about how there does seem to be a resurgence in spiritualities of the interior life among lots of people, and many people dissatisfied with their exposure to the Christian tradition in what seems to be a very external focus. That is, be a good person, do the right kinds of things, and then you will make it into heaven, and God will kind of take care of the transformation later. Out of a sort of repugnance of that, a hollowness to it that I share, people often flee to religions of the East, Buddhism, forms of Hinduism and Vedanta. I should say first, I have also sought lots of wisdom in those traditions, and I find them to be very helpful. And also, people don't often know that we being Christians, have our own mystical, contemplative, transformative traditions, not just one, but many streams that do offer something like a Zen mindfulness or an approach to Buddhism that focuses on keeping watch over the thoughts, like many forms of Theravada Buddhism, and so on. And so I do not mean to reduce Christian mysticism to a form of Buddhism or, vice versa, to call Buddhism sort of a poor form of Christian mysticism. I think each tradition stands robustly on its own. But that's just to say we get an urge for something, and we often leave to find it when it was here all along. And hopefully this week's session and next week's session will whet your appetite for some of these spiritualities. I had the very good fortune to come into the church in the early 2000s, as I was sharing earlier, under the tutelage of Benedictine monks, whose way of life goes straight back to the fathers and mothers of the desert. And so the books they were handing me about prayer and about the sort of the life of the Christian writ large were all drawing on this spirituality. And so I thought this was what Catholicism was. And in fact, it is, a large part of it. But more and more, I met people who had never heard of either the writings of St. Benedict, but, the Desert Fathers and Mothers, or the vast spiritual tradition that spans from when these folks went into the desert all the way to today. And so I'm very excited to share this anywhere I go. This is really at the heart of how I practice as a Christian. When from time to time I'm asked to provide some direction, this is at the heart of how I direct, just sort of helping people to find a way to find in silence, the God who's sort of always present. And I think the Desert Fathers and Mothers help us to do that. So without further ado, we're going to start with the same reading from Mark that we've used to introduce all of our sessions. And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. And as he was coming up out of the water, he immediately saw the heavens being ripped apart, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him, and a voice come out of the heavens, "You are my beloved Son, and you I have taken delight." And immediately the Spirit cast him into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tested by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and the angels were serving him. One of the themes that we have been drawing on, and in fact, an important part of the landscape, the mental and emotional landscape of these people, was the sense of a cosmos that was pregnant with life, of beings that flitted from place to place. We might call them angels and demons, but the sort of ecology, the spiritual landscape of these people wasn't usually content to just lump people into black or white, good or bad, but to see, they were inheriting Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Sumerian, Assyrian mythologies where spiritual beings were not all good or were not all bad, but like humans, had to sort of make their way in the world. And so some spirits were really, really bad and shouldn't be messed with. Others were more mischievous. Others might appear bad, but were actually being used by God to help people. I'm looking at Job here, where Satan is depicted as sort of a prosecuting attorney working for God. And so even as sort of Orthodox Christianity began to elaborate its own mythology of who these beings were, the Desert Fathers and Mothers were inheriting a landscape where the spirits were always sort of testing them, poking at them, trying to see just what humans were. And we see this even in Mark, where Jesus goes out to be tested by Satan, but there's no clear understanding of why. Whether Jesus could actually be tempted away from his divine vocation, or whether, the Satan, the sort of prosecuting attorney, is trying to figure out who this guy is and is going to test him to see just how far he'll go. That understanding is carried by the Desert Fathers and Mothers into the desert, where they go to sort of expose themselves to this ecology, the spiritual ecology of not just wild animals, but of spirits that are going to test them, going to try them. And they go, we find, not to find peace, not to escape these sorts of spiritual, sometimes violent beings, but to be tested. Because in the testing, that is where they seem to find God. And we'll talk more about that. All right. A recap from last week. This spirituality begins with the assumption that baptism works, that it does something. And these are adults being baptized for the most part. So the assumption is that in being baptized into Christ's death, we're also raised with him into a new form of life. One that didn't just wait for when you're dead to sort of kick into action, but one whose evidence should be seen in life itself. And for these folks, that was in the ability to go into the desert and to be fed by God. That is, to find satisfaction and love and enjoyment and all the things that people look to the world to provide, to find that in God alone, with Christ as sort of the model of someone who could find God in the desert. So these people went to the desert to sort of test their baptisms, to see, okay, if we take this at face value, if all these things that are being talked about in our scriptures are true, we should be able to find out, right? So as we talked about last week, they underwent a series of social deaths, ways of dying to the self that's constructed whenever humans live in society, to see what's underneath it, what comes through. Or to use St. Paul's metaphor, if you burn it, let's see what gets burned away, and let's see the gold that remains underneath. And these took the form of how later monastic writers systematized 3 renunciations. That is a sort of threefold path to discovering the life that God has put in us. First, renouncing our former way of life. This is put in very dramatic terms by the Desert Mothers and Fathers. They leave. They flee. I was a merchant. Now I'm not anymore. I just live in a cave, right? I was the tutor to an emperor. Not anymore. I just live in a cave. I was a highwayman. I robbed people for money and killed some of them. Not anymore. I live actually in a cell that I built from bricks that looks like a cave. So these people do renounce their former way of life. And that creates a certain sort of spaciousness. They no longer have to deal with the things that they dealt with before. Last week we talked about anger as being a motivating factor for a lot of these people. They were frustrated with their lot in life, with having to compete with their neighbors, raising crops only to see Rome take a good portion of them. And so they just left. And we remember these people don't begin as saints, they begin as normal people. So they leave because they're irritated at society and they're irritated at not having what they need, and they see this promise of a new kind of life in the desert, and so they leave to go find it. But what do they find when they get there? Well, the world has sort of followed them. I can leave the people I'm angry at. Does that make me not angry with them anymore? No. I can leave, the people I'm obsessed with. Does that mean I stop obsessing over them? I can leave the people to whom I'm comparing myself. Do I stop comparing myself to other people? No. And thus begins the second renunciation. These mothers and fathers have carried their lives in with them, and it's too sticky. They can't get rid of it. So what do they do all day other than think about the life that they used to have? And we have enough sayings that this is what a lot of, especially the younger monks, and that's an inclusive term, for women and male renunciates, that they kept obsessing because they had 20, 30 years of thinking about these things. It's not like you can just stop your mind. And so the question begins, what do I do with my thoughts? What do I do with them? Do I enter into dialogue with them? Do I have conversations with my thoughts? Do I try to ignore them? Do I try to bliss out and not think about anything? This is the question that Abba Anthony goes to the desert to find out. What do I do with my thoughts? And that's where we're going to focus today. The third renunciation, which we're probably not going to get to in this series, is once thoughts are dealt with. That doesn't mean they go away, but once we've sort of mastered our internal landscape, sort of who we are, the contours of how our minds work, if we're desert mothers and fathers or their spiritual successors. Once we've done that and we've managed to carve out a little bit of peace, which is not necessarily the absence of thought, but a sort of peaceful collaboration with. Once we are no longer dominated and carried away by the trains of thought, what do we have left? Do we have God? Or is God yet another thought? And so the third renunciation is to begin to think about God and then to let even those thoughts go, to see what's underneath. Because God has to be not just a thought. Is there anything to God that's more than what I can think about God? And if so, is this an experience? Is this not an experience? There's some really rich literature that sort of progresses into the Middle Ages that asks this question, which we're not going to talk about at all, but we will at another time. This is where a text like the Cloud of Unknowing become very important. But there are also some Eastern texts, that is Eastern Christian texts, that also help us here. Okay, we're going to have an experiment. I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes. I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes. And here's the goal. When you hear the bell go off, I want you to just start counting your thoughts. So don't try to think anything. Don't try not to think anything. Just sort of be present. Watch your mind like you're turning on Netflix and you're seeing what's on. And count every time you have a new thought. Okay? There's a thought, that's one. If you find yourself thinking about whether that was a thought, that's a thought. Count it, that's two. If you get distracted, just remember the last number you said and either add 1 or 10 or whatever you feel like. You're not going to be tested, but we're just going to get a taste of this experientially so that we can kind of enter into the mindset. Hearing stuff counts as thoughts. Basically, any sort of activity counts as a thought. Okay, ready? Here we go. And we can go ahead and close our eyes. Hear the bell once to start and once to stop. All right. Raise your hand if you had more than 5 thoughts. More than 20? Raise your hand if you couldn't even count them. It was too complicated to write. So to even begin to observe one's thoughts takes a certain amount of practice, of silence perhaps, and of sort of focus, just to try to count them. You begin wondering, well, is that a thought? And is the thing I just thought a thought about the thought? And what's the point of this? And again, this is just helping us to see these desert fathers and mothers. What did they do all day? Well, they worked, but that work was intentionally manual labor, weaving baskets for the most part. And anyone here crochet or do any kind of weaving with the hands? Right. This is work that you can do that sort of, once you're good enough at it, it frees your mind. And that was the point. They didn't want to do nothing, but they also didn't want to be engaged in things that carried them away from their thoughts. So the practice was to work and to pray. But here, prayer means to begin to pay attention to spirit, which is, sort of in this milieu, is everything that's going on that is accessible through not just the senses, but through the soul. So the hands are busy, and part of the mind is busy. This goes under this, and that goes under this. But then the mind is sort of free to ruminate. And attempts to pray, that is to sort of establish direct contact with God. As anyone who's ever tried to pray, you could do that. You can reach out and touch, but then 5 minutes later, you're thinking about dinner, right? 5 minutes later, you're planning out your day. Or maybe you're feeling bad that you're not having the experience that you thought about having before this started. And so the question is, what do we do? Like, what is the work here? How is this worth my time being out here all the time around nobody? And how is this supposed to make me better? How is this putting me in touch with the life of the resurrection? Where is God here? Should I be feeling blissful thoughts? Should I be elevated above myself? Should I be feeling bad about myself all the time? Should I be feeling nothing? Are there correct feelings to be having right now? Should I be paying attention to my feelings or not? All these questions were live, and this was a great experiment. It was a great experiment whose proof was nothing other than the holiness of people who had been doing this for a long time. We remember that Abba Anthony, sort of the father of the desert fathers and mothers, was 106 when he died, and everyone remembers him as being super friendly, quiet, but sociable, able to laugh at a joke, and not strange, which is not what you'd expect from someone who kept going out further into the desert to get away from people. His time in the desert made him more human, not less. So what could he have been possibly doing out there such that he wasn't just a gibbering mess of neurotic impulses, which is what I would be after 10 minutes sitting by myself? The answer to this comes in the form of a tradition that we receive through 2 primary figures. And this is the only history that I'm going to be doing today after lots and lots of history. This is Agrius Ponticus. He was born into a Christian family in a small town in Turkey. He was raised as a highly educated classical scholar and was a cleric. He was an archdeacon at one point, and he frequented the elite circles of the Constantinopolitan church at the time, which we remember from 2 weeks ago had been made the center of the empire and sort of was the life of the beating heart of the empire. So he dressed the dressed and ate the food and socialized the socials. And he got quite caught up in worldly life. The stories tell us that he fell in love with a married woman and was sort of obsessing over her. And he had a vision in which he was imprisoned by the soldiers of the court at the request of the woman's husband. Whether he had a vision of that or had a memory of that, we don't know. But what he did was flee to Jerusalem, where he stayed with Melania the Elder, who we met in our first week, who was a young widow who gave some money to the Desert Fathers and was very impressed and stunned by their lack of care about money or anything, and went on to found a monastery in Jerusalem. He found her and eventually took her advice to go to the desert. And so he went to Egypt, and he studied under Macarius the Great, who's one of the great desert fathers, who Macarius himself was a student of Anthony the Great. And he lived at Scetis, among other places. Because of his education, he was one who was able to systematize the early sayings. So all the sayings we've been talking about were collected orally. They were just passed on. A lot of these people were illiterate or just didn't have access to writing. Avagrius collected them and began to think about them systematically. That is, to put them in a system and to begin to see how things connected to one another. So he's the first to look through the sayings, which had not yet been compiled into the apothegmata yet, and to ask, okay, what are we doing? Is there a system here? Is there something that can be taught, a tradition of spiritual learning? He had a student named Jon Cashion, who was born in the 360s in what's now modern-day Romania. He was also classically trained in Latin and Greek. We know little about his early life, but he left for Palestine and settled in a monastic settlement in Bethlehem, inspired by the lives of the Desert Fathers and Mothers. But he wasn't content just to hear about them. He went to live with them and seemed to travel throughout Palestine and Egypt, collecting sayings. He has his own collection of sayings that meant something to him. And he ended up, after his time with the monks, back in Constantinople, where he was ordained to the diaconate. And then we really don't know what he did other than wander, share his wisdom. He's founded some monasteries in Gaul, made his way up to Marseille in the 410s, and then he died in the 430s. So he was also a systematizer. He wrote 12 institutes and 24 conferences, that is, collections meant for novice and experienced monks. And in fact, Benedict in his rule recommends at the end that the rule is good, and also if you want more, read Cashion and read Basil the Great, who's an Eastern figure we're not going to talk about. So he, along with Avagrius, are two of the earliest systematizers, two of the earliest reflectors on how this works. And they traveled widely enough to see, again, this is an experiment. So they have opinions. This is what works. This is what doesn't. Here, try this, and don't try this. Because this is nothing if not a practical matter. How much should you fast? Well, it depends. What do you want to get out of it? So I'll be relying on largely their writings for the bulk of what we're going to talk about, sort of the mental prayer, or the aspect of thought. So we're going to go back to our 3 renunciations. So we decide we want to seek our heart's desire. We don't know what that is, other than it's not any of this. And we're daring enough to call that desire God, right? God is our heart's desire. And so we are going to spend the rest of our lives seeking our heart's desire. We've renounced our former way of life. That is, we've wandered into this way of life, sort of half thinking, half awake, and we look around one day and it's just not doing it. And so we find a way to renounce that. Maybe we flee to the desert. Maybe there are other forms of flight that we can do in everyday life, which is a question I think we have to ask ourselves. But whatever it is, to fully appropriate our Christian vocation, whether we were baptized babies or not, this theology, this way of thinking says at some point we reflect on our lives and we decide we haven't been awake. We haven't been really trying. We haven't been doing anything other than just sort of coasting on momentum. So now we're going to make a break and we're going to try again. Now the secret is we'll probably do this a number of times. There's always sort of a time when I realize, I haven't really been a Christian, have I? I've just been sort of half-hearting it. Well, now I have more heart to put into it, but maybe in 30 years I'll look back on this and wonder, what was I doing again? Did I really know? Nevertheless, sometimes there are more dramatic moments than others. Sometimes it's marked by tragedy. Sometimes people take vows. Sometimes people really do uproot and move other places. But there tend to be landmarks. And then we pursue a way of life that is freer from all this stuff. We journey into the silence, which doesn't necessarily have to be the absence of noise, but just the absence of clutter, mental, emotional clutter, things that pull us away from our heart's desire, from wanting it. But then, as we talked about earlier, even when we do that, there's still plenty of noise. There's still plenty of clutter. We get distracted. We get obsessive about certain things. We even find ourselves thinking that we're pursuing our heart's desire and then find that it's really not, that we've linked it with something else that is not what we thought it was. And so the second renunciation is about renouncing our mindless thoughts. And that phrase is intentional. Comes from a spiritual writer named Mary Margaret Funk, who's, in addition to having an awesome name, is a really eloquent writer in the Benedictine tradition. Renouncing our mindless thoughts. What does that phrase indicate to you? What are we renouncing? What's a mindless thought? Mary Jo?
Maybe a thought that drains us or takes us down or depletes us.
Okay. Yes. So the effect maybe of mindless thoughts is it brings a decrease in life rather than an increase in life. Okay. What else comes to mind when you think about a mindless thought as opposed to what?
Something that's not intentional.
Yes.
You're not really deciding to think about it, just comes to you.
Right. It is a thought that is thinking itself in you or around you, right? A mindless thought. Have you ever noticed you've been caught up in a mindless thought? I didn't start this thought. Maybe I started another one, but this one is just sort of running away, right? The Desert Fathers and Mothers and those who came after noticed that that thoughts have a life of their own, and they can sort of take up residence. But we can sort of live passively with them, being carried away by them. And again, we find ourselves making life decisions based on mindless thinking. This is the quintessential midlife crisis drama, which apparently no longer exists. People my age no longer have midlife crises. We're just hoping to buy a house someday. But in sort of the presentation of it through the 50s and 60s, it's, I have everything I need, and I've realized I'm not alive to my life at all. And so I'm either going to buy a Ferrari and have an affair or go find a guru. And there are lots of good stories in fiction about this. But the point is, we discover that we have been living a life that is not our own, that another life has been thinking itself in us all along, and we want some more agency. Yeah, Maureen?
I'm wondering now, what is the difference between that and inspiration?
Hold on to that thought. Hold on to that thought. Well, and now I'm gonna do something. Yeah.
I think it's just like turning on a computer. You spend 4 hours or you only been going there for 5 minutes.
Yes.
That's mindless thoughts.
Yes.
All the rest of it's mindless.
Yeah, the millennials call that doom scrolling. It's when you're just like, right. But I think the answer is inspiration comes and you let it go. If it's real, it'll stick around. If it's real, and we'll get to that in a minute. Abba Moses said, go sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. Well, what is your cell? It's just being here. Go be where you are. In this case, a physical place, but be exactly where you are and pay attention to what's going on there, and you will learn everything you need to know. How much would people pay to have peace of mind? To not be carried away by thoughts of despair, of self-doubt, of shame. I bet some people would pay a lot of money, and in fact do, to go on retreats, to see high-profile gurus, spiritual thinkers, to go and find happiness. Because what if we make misery for ourselves? Now, I'm a middle-of-the-road guy. I think the world also makes us miserable, but we can help it out sometimes. And so the work is prayer, that is being attentive, punctuated by opportunities to be hospitable to other people and provide them service. And this is the life of the Desert Father and Mother. They work, they try to stay away from people. When people get too much, they go further into the desert. But when people show up, you pull out all the stops. You treat them as inspiration, as an angel, as God has visited you, all the while paying attention. Like thoughts, people have a life of their own. Some people, like thoughts, some people decrease our available store of life, and others increase them. And we pay attention to that. We don't necessarily react to it in the person's presence. We have lots of sayings from the Desert Fathers where they say, don't come anymore, or they'll just run away. Because paying attention to how we are around other people tells us something about what's going on. And until I have that under control, it's not going to be to anyone's benefit. Sort of the put on your own oxygen mask point of view. There are other ways. This is just one way. So all in this, whether we're going to a party, or we're sitting at home trying to read a book, or we're saying our prayers, or we're at Mass, or we're a Desert Father and Mother weaving a basket, thoughts. What do we do with the thoughts? Well, one thing, as we learn to pay attention to them, is to notice what kinds of thoughts that we're having. And so these early systematizers, drawing on people like Abba Anthony, Abba Moses, noticed that thoughts come in kinds. There are ways that we can sort of group thoughts together, and that helps us to organize, like, this person makes me feel this thoughts, or when I remember this memory, I have these kinds of thoughts. It carries me along in this way. And slowly but surely, we get to know our own minds, which are not under our control, right? They have a life, our minds have a life of their own. And so we begin to name the thoughts. What are these thoughts doing? What are they seeking? Do they have a trajectory? Is there something that they want or that they're trying to get away from? And so they develop a familiarity with these thoughts. And depending on the kind of thought, there may be a different way of dealing with it. Certain thoughts you hit head on. You say, no, this is not the way. Other thoughts you don't want to hit head on. You want to go around them, because if you engage with them, they will drag you down. A good example of a thought that the Desert Fathers and Mothers thought you shouldn't entertain would be thoughts of lust, right? If you're having a fantasy, the worst thing you can do is like, oh, well, I wonder, what is this thought? It will drag you down into it. So you do other things. You go to work, you take a cold shower, which wasn't available in the desert. You go around it. But other kinds of thoughts, like self-image, vainglory, then you go at it and you say, well, am I? What do I actually look like? What am I doing here? And you can kind of engage with it. Not only that, but thoughts aren't static. They grow. They develop. They gain life. And they notice, as you notice, thoughts don't just stay. If you feed them with a kind of attention, they grow. You can have a thought about something. There's ice cream in the world. But if I pay attention to that, it turns into, I want ice cream in the world. And maybe if I pay even more attention to that desire, I begin to tell a story about the desire. Why can't I have that ice cream again? Who's telling me that I can't use my money to buy as much ice cream as I want? And then, all of a sudden, that thought is entering my mind when I'm doing like right now I'm thinking about ice cream. I don't mean to. I'm talking about the Desert Fathers and Mothers. But ice cream is thinking itself in me. It's become what this tradition would call a passion, from the same root as passive. I am passive to the thought, and the thought is thinking itself in me habitually. It's taken root in me. And eventually, it wears me down so that if you put me around ice cream, I'm going to eat it. Because I've been thinking about eating it the whole time. Maybe I'll resist it once. But eventually, if all I'm doing is thinking about money, and I have the opportunity to make a ton of money quick, even if it's maybe not the best way I could be using my time, if I haven't been thinking other thoughts that would help me to navigate that, then I'm just going to fall into it, right? This is a passion. It carries us along. And so the Desert Fathers and Mothers noticed that people's life decisions are motivated often not by their careful discernment, but by the trail of thoughts that have been carrying them along since their parents started talking about it when they were 5, right? It's a life that's being thought of in us, and we just consent to it. We're carried along. But thoughts can be fruitful. We can have good thoughts. And we can feed those good thoughts by paying attention to them and by cultivating certain desires for them. And those thoughts can also think themselves habitually in us. And so this isn't a mindlessness game. This isn't a we shouldn't be thinking at all. This is are the thoughts that we're feeding, that are carrying us along, are they carrying us towards our goal? It is, to some extent, being in control of our uncontrolled thoughts. So, you could pay a lot of attention to nutrition. You could pay attention to not just what you should be eating, but to how certain foods make your body feel, right? And really paying attention to it. And over time, I discover, actually, if I eat too much ice cream, I just don't like the way I feel. And that's what I'm paying attention to, not just the pleasure of the eating of the ice cream, but how it carries me into it. And gradually, maybe when I encounter ice cream, I think, tastes good. Not looking forward to the aftermath. So it actually changes our emotional orientations towards these things. The same can be true for, I spent a long time trying to make money and I realized I was miserable. So maybe I should think about doing other kinds of things. I no longer want these things. So this is about cultivating the landscape of our interior life through paying attention to what we're feeding and what we're not feeding. Now, one question we can raise here is sort of how we imagine this, right? So far, we've kind of been talking about this taking place within us, right? This is all in my head. But things weren't that simple for the Desert Fathers and Mothers. Because our thoughts are mediating our access to everything else, right? You all are nothing other than, to some extent, what I'm thinking about you. That's how I get access to you. And so there were ways of thinking about these thoughts as not just being in me, but maybe being outside of me. This is a famous painting of Abba Anthony being attacked by the 8 thoughts. And maybe you've felt besieged by intrusive thoughts. This is language that we tend to use today. As though things were trying to think themselves in you and you just want it to go away. Anxious thoughts or a nagging feeling. And so one of the ways that the Desert Fathers and Mothers imagined this was thoughts are not just inside, thoughts are outside. And in fact, thoughts are demons. Demons are thoughts. The realm in which demons live is the realm of thought. And they come to us in the form of thoughts, sort of shooting little fiery darts, hoping that one kind of takes root, or maybe trying to plant seeds. So Abba Pitarion, disciple of Abba Anthony, said, if anyone wants to drive out the demons, he must first subdue the passions, for he will banish the demon of the passion which he has mastered. For example, the devil accompanies anger, so if you control your anger, the devil of anger will be banished. And so it is for each of the passions. So the idea is, or one way of looking at it, is not that this is just in me, but these sort of parasitic mental beings are feeding off of what I have to feed them. And if I continue to feed them, they will continue to plague me, and I will continue to live a life that is not my own, live a life that is thoroughly demonic. And here, they're not thinking like, my head is spinning around and I'm puking pea soup at people. The demonic is at once sort of far less dramatic and everyday, but also for that reason, a lot more sinister. These beings are themselves sort of mindless, just looking to recreate themselves by attaching themselves to us and feeding on anger. So this can be a helpful way of looking at thoughts. What being am I feeding? Who am I giving my energy to, or what am I giving my energy to? It happened that Abba Moses was struggling with the temptation of fornication. Unable to stay any longer in the cell, he went and told Abba Isidore. The man exhorted him to return to his cell, but he refused, saying, Abba, I cannot. Then Abba Isidore took Moses out onto the terrace and said to him, look towards the west. He looked and saw hordes of demons flying about and making a noise before launching an attack. Then Abbot Isidore said to him, "Look towards the east." He turned and saw an innumerable multitude of holy angels shining with glory. Abbot Isidore said, "See, these are sent by the Lord to the saints to bring them help, while those in the west fight against them. Those who are with us are more in number than they are." Then Abbot Moses gave thanks to God, plucked up his courage, and returned to his cell. The question here, I think, is not, is this real? It is it helpful? That is, thinking about sort of these conflicts and externalizing them. It's not, these are not materialist scientists who are sort of mapping the brain to figure out what's really real there. They are engaging in the spiritual life. They're trying to live their lives. And many of them found a lot of help in thinking they're also good thoughts that are going to help me. I'm going to pay attention to those. They're going to help me against the bad thoughts. And the mere act of externalizing them gave them a sense of agency, a sense of control. And I think we can find this helpful without falling into superstition, or without necessarily buying into everything that people who see angels and demons everywhere may want us to do. Seeing this as a helpful way of thinking and seeing how far it takes us, ready to say, okay, and at this point, I'm ready to sort of recognize the realities of neuroscience. I think we can have it both ways. In fact, modern therapy with internal family systems is doing a lot of this, where we sort of map the way our relationships reproduce themselves in our internal landscape, even in ways that they have a life of their own. I keep hearing my mom's voice, or I feel the pressure of my dad to do these things. We don't have to think that that they're small humans in me to gain some relief from saying that this is not me. It's also not me. So maybe it's both. This is Cordyceps. Anyone know about Cordyceps? This is a fungal parasite that can take over small organisms and control them to get them to go to where they will find the best food, and then eventually devour them from the inside. Good night. Sleep tight. In a way, our thoughts are inside and outside of us. They seem to come from outside, and yet we feed them and reproduce them until we are nothing other than, though always more than, a vehicle for these thoughts. Amma Syncletica said, "We must arm ourselves in every way against the demons, for they attack us from outside, and they also stir us up from within. And the soul is then like a ship when great waves break over it, and at the same time it sinks because the hold is too full. We are just like that. We lose as much by the exterior faults we commit as by the thoughts inside us. So we must watch for the attacks of men that come from outside us, and also repel the interior onslaughts of our thoughts." So a lot of this is sort of changing our perspective on what we think we are and what we think is going on in everyday life. To some extent, for the Desert Fathers and Mothers, it doesn't matter what you're doing in your external life. That is, salvation comes in this process. Salvation comes from gaining some sort of mastership. Don't love that word. Don't love the word control. Stewardship, maybe. From recognizing that this wild stuff in me is my garden to tend, and I am responsible for it, for the fruits that grow and the thorns and everything else. No one else is responsible for that but me and God in me. But I have to learn how to be there. And so, to some extent, the external stuff only matters insofar as it's helping me or hindering to do these things. It only matters insofar as it is helping me to gain some sort of agency in my unthought thoughts and find actual joy. Again, this is about the heart's desire. And so various kinds of practices emerge in these traditions. I've sort of categorized them, and there are more than this, but forms of undoing, so ways in which we are passive, we let go of things, and then forms of doings, things that we actually do. Undoings like repenting, letting go of past problems. Interpretation of dreams comes up sometimes in this literature as a sign of these unthought, these mindless thoughts. Mindless thoughts are also active when we're sleeping, so we can gain some insight into them if we pay attention to our dreams. Freud wasn't the first to do this, though he was maybe more creative. Fasting. What happens when I deprive my body of its wants? What if I give it just enough? How much is enough that I'm not obsessing over food and I'm also not sort of satiated? Watchfulness, that is just the practice of paying attention without trying to intervene. I'm not going to feel bad about my thoughts. I'm just going to see what comes up, but I'm not going to feed them either. And then the doings. Manifestation, and this was incredibly important to the desert fathers and mothers. I have to share my thoughts with others. That is, with a spiritual elder. They would not have thought of trying this alone. That is why young monks went into the desert, to find an elder where they could gain some awareness of sort of the thoughts as they were thinking themselves, but then to go to someone with experience and to say, here's what my thoughts are doing. Here's what my thoughts are doing. Can you help me? I can't stop thinking about this. Or try as I might, I keep on thinking about this, and then it leads me to do this. So this is the earliest form of confession that we get. But it's not about absolution, because these monks were not usually priests. Rather, it was about diagnosis, sort of an early form of psychotherapy. But really not, and I don't want to elide those two too much. But the manifestation of thoughts to someone else who has a little bit more objectivity in being able to say, yes, I dealt with that, it'll go away, or I'm still dealing with that. But also just the companionship, the not being alone in the thoughts was tremendously helpful. And then there were sort of these, what you might call grounding practices, humbling oneself, being insulted and not saying anything, but just paying attention. What happens when I'm insulted? Some of the stories seem a little bit, off-putting. You'll hear desert sayings that, so-and-so went to a famous monk and he insulted him to test him, and the monk went away sad, and sort of the older monk knew he's not ready for this. That can seem really off-putting to us until you realize that father or mother was trying to figure out, can this person sit alone in their cell? If they can't handle me saying something without investigating it, sort of not reacting immediately, there is no way they will survive out here. They will go crazy. And so it's kind of a test. And so learning to humble oneself, that is, to accept perceived slights and insults, because we're not quite sure whether they're real or not. How much of this is my ego, and how much of it is meant to be an insult. And in a social world that was sort of very, very sensitive to perceived slights, because everyone has a station, as was the case most anywhere in late antiquity. Everyone was exquisitely sensitive to what they were owed according to where they were in society and who they were interacting with. Letting go of this was an important part of entering into the desert, especially for those who are leaving privilege, to learn how not to be bothered when someone who should be my slave is treating me like an equal. These are unthought thoughts. They just happen in us. If the wrong person says something to me and I've already sort of judged them to be someone who shouldn't talk to me like that, that thought thinks itself and I react to it. We do it with our kids. We do it with people at work. These thoughts think themselves. So humbling ourselves, looking for an opportunity to see, where's my ego bruised? Ministry. And here we could mean like church ministry, because plenty of these, especially men in a world that ordained only men, people wanted to ordain them into service, and they really didn't want to be deacons and priests. They really, really didn't want it because they were fleeing. They did not want a form of life. They, in many cases, especially in the later years, once Christianity was no longer persecuted, they saw the church as recreating in many ways the same landscape as the empire. That is, privileges, statuses, expectations. That's what they left. Why do I want to do a churchy version of, being a merchant, being an accountant, being a highwayman? And so they tried to say no, but sometimes saying yes was also an important step towards grounding, towards accepting a different way of life as a kind of inspiration. And then finally, table fellowship. These solitaries did return for Eucharist, and Eucharist at that time would have been paired with a banquet, would have been paired with a feast. And so learning to be at table with other people and seeing that as an occasion, again, for not letting go of watchfulness. I can pay attention to myself when I'm alone in my cell doing my baskets. What happens when I go to the party? What happens when there's wine? I like wine. What happens when there's meat? What am I going to do? This can be an occasion for learning, for paying attention. What happens? But also an occasion for edification, for entering into relationships that are helpful and healthy. This is Avagrius. If there's any monk who wishes to take the measure of some of the more fierce demons so as to gain experience in his monastic art, then let him keep watch over his thoughts. Let him observe their intensity, their periods of decline, and follow them as they rise and fall. Let him note well the complexity of his thoughts, their periodicity, that is how often they come, the demons which cause them, with the order of their succession and the nature of their associations. Then let him ask from Christ the explanations of these data he has observed. For the demons become thoroughly infuriated with those who practice active virtue in a manner that is increasingly contemplative. They're even of a mind to pierce the upright of heart through under the cover of darkness. This is lovely, and what I really like about this insight, and we'll leave off here, the demons become, Avagrius thinks, thoroughly infuriated with those who practice active virtue in a manner that is increasingly contemplative. What does that mean? That what irritates the demons isn't so much the active virtue, but practicing them in a way that is increasingly contemplative. Is there another way to practice virtue? There is the act of seeming virtuous, of figuring out which virtues are easy for me to practice, maybe for the sake of others, maybe for the sake of my own self-observation, but it is not contemplative. That is, it is not diagnosed according to what thoughts are actually happening. I fast all the time. I don't care about food, right? I fast all the time, but I'm full of myself. My virtue isn't contemplative. It is not actually responding to my internal landscape. And so my fasting doesn't do me any good. In fact, the demons kind of like it because my virtue is feeding a different demon. You see? It's only the act of attentiveness, noting well the complexity of our thoughts, how often they come, the rise and fall, getting to know ourselves, getting to know the selves that we have built and that the world has built, that our parents have built, that the selves under which we are, we're in some control of these things, but less than we think. Getting to know this about ourselves and then beginning to probe, where is there flexibility? Where is there room for growth? Maybe I can't change this about myself. Maybe I will never be able to fast because of my body, because of how, 40 years of eating has pretty much made my body hard in these areas. I can't really do the fasting thing, but maybe I can do other things. Until I start paying attention to this, I won't know that. Or maybe what looks for me like I think I'm humiliating myself, but maybe that's a way of hiding from the fact that I am just not outspoken. And maybe instead of humiliating myself and always sort of retreating, maybe the right thing to do for growth would be to put myself out there, to be louder when others are trying to shout me down. It's all about mindfulness in a way. Okay, so we'll pick up next week with looking at these 8 categories that both Cashion and Avagrius come up with to diagnose the thoughts. The Greek word is logismoi, from logos, the idea that these are thoughts that come in clusters, trains, they develop, they have life. And they found 8 of them. Later, they would sort of morph into the 7 deadly sins. But notice the development there from the sort of thoughts that are living in us to the stuff that we do, right? When we only focus on the 7 deadly sins, I think we lose where they come from, how they're generated. So these are the 8. I'll have different translations for them because we don't use some of this language. So we'll talk about them, about some of the remedies and things like that next week, and we'll wrap up there. Handouts are right here if you've missed any. This week, the extra reading is a lovely chapter from a Cistercian writer, one of my favorites. His name is Michael Casey. He's a Cistercian in Australia. This chapter on asceticism, it's about the rule of St. Benedict, but it's really drawing on this wisdom, on sort of the point of the ascetic life that is of withdrawal of any kind in order to pay attention. So you may enjoy that. And then there's some sayings at the table. I'll provide those again next week. They'll be the sort of fodder for our discussion. Good? Okay. See you next week.